policies. So much for separation of power. So much for checks and balances. And when we talk about these constitutional ambiguities or these extra legal powers, we're talking about the powers of executive privilege, the powers of executive agreement, the power of impoundment, and the expansion of the commander-in-chief role. All four of these powers have to some degree been asserted by the Trump administration. Now, when you look at these four powers, executive privilege, executive agreement, impoundment, and expansion of the commander-in-chief role, only the commander-in-chief role is mentioned anywhere in our Constitution. These other powers, executive privilege, executive agreement, and impoundment, have been asserted by presidents, and not just President Trump, but past presidents, without any legal justification. So the question is, what are these powers? And can the president really exercise them? And as we said, this president has. So when we talk about these, we're talking about executive privilege, executive agreement, impoundment, and the expansion of the commander-in-chief role. Okay, so let's talk about these. Well, as we said, President Trump has used executive privilege a lot. Now, what's executive privilege? The president has defined it as the right of a president to withhold information whenever the president thinks it is necessary. Again, remember, this term, executive privilege, is not to be found anywhere in the Constitution, not used anywhere in the Constitution. So presidents who use this term usually cite what they call the historical precedents for this. And they even go all the way back to President Washington, our very first president. And they'll say, well, President Washington denied the House information related to the Jay Treaty, which, by the way, is true. But the simple reason he did this is because he realized that the Constitution specified that only the Senate had the right to information related to treaties. So he was doing it to comply with the Constitution, not to contradict the Constitution. But generally what we saw was this right of executive agreement was used very sparsely throughout most of our history. And it really wasn't until the Eisenhower administration that this power became exercised more extensively. So during the Eisenhower administration, there were over 40 instances in which the president refused information to Congress due to what he claimed was executive privilege. And then President Nixon, after that, in the 1960s and 70s, did the same thing. And it was probably the most famous example of withholding of information. President Nixon was under criminal investigation, the so-called Watergate hearings. And the House of Representatives did an investigation of his staff. And his staff said, yes, there are tapes being made by the president that nobody knows about that actually has recorded some of his illegal dealings. So Congress requested those tapes, the Watergate tapes. President Nixon refused to give them. And what we'll see is that led to a Supreme Court case called Nixon versus the United States in 1974. And in that case, the United States Supreme Court held unanimously that the Constitution did not endow the president with this type of power. So if you apply it to what President Trump's doing, and he's withholding it even more than Nixon ever did, he's not letting anybody testify. He's not complying with any request for information or documents. You would think that the court's probably going to hold the same thing, but in this new world of partisan politics, who knows? So that's what we mean by executive privilege. Executive agreement. Well, executive agreement has been interpreted by presidents as permitting them to enter into formal arrangements with foreign nations without Senate approval. So it's kind of like a treaty where you just cut Congress out. They don't even have to approve it. They don't even have to be notified of it. And again, what modern presidents like President Trump will say is that past presidents have done this, so it's already been established. And he'll cite, for example, James Monroe, who says, after consulting with the Senate, made an executive agreement with Great Britain, which called for the limiting of forces on the Great Lakes. Well, again, the problem with this was Congress in this case specifically said they would give the president a right to enter into this agreement, because they said it was for a minor issue. But again, what happened is modern presidents, and not just President Trump, but for example, President Nixon, expanded the use of this power significantly. And some said abused the power. So during his administration, President Nixon negotiated 71 treaties that went to United States Senate. But at the same time, he negotiated 608 executive agreements. And these agreements included issues such as the establishment of military bases and the stationing of nuclear weapons and atomic energy. So not minor issues. And again, the question is, where are we now? The President Trump, has used this with agreements with China, with Saudi Arabia, with Turkey. Impoundment, what's that? Well, this kind of relates to what I was telling you about before. Impoundment is when a president says that they can forbid an administrative agency from spending funds that have been appropriated by the United States Congress for public programs and policies. Again, another power not included anywhere in the Constitution, which has been used by some modern presidents to set policy and actually frustrate the explicit will of the United States Congress. And again, it was used historically for very limited purposes. So President Jefferson, just as an example, who's being cited by some modern presidents, declined to spend money that had been appropriated by Congress for gunboats, which were to patrol the Mississippi River. And that is true. But what's not told is that he did this because the United States had acquired, after this appropriation, the Louisiana Territory, eliminating any immediate dangers on the Mississippi River. So there was no need to patrol the Mississippi River now. It was no longer our western border. So using this, recent presidents have said they have the power and the authority to appropriate money whenever they want. And again, the example of President Trump appropriating money delegated for the Ukraine to defend itself against Russian invasion. The last power that we're talking about, we said, does have a constitutional basis, and that's Commander-in-Chief. But this power is mentioned in the term of extra-legal or constitutional ambiguities because it deals with a constitutional debate between Congress and the President. So, recent presidents and President Trump has argued that according to the Constitution, he's the head of the military, so he can unilaterally decide when troops will be committed to imminent hostilities. He can decide whether to unilaterally bomb another country and do this without the consent of Congress. Okay. These are some very important conflicts here. So, what has Congress, what has our courts and the Supreme Court in particular said in the past about the usage of these kinds of things? Well, let's give you some examples. For executive privilege, we talked about Nixon versus the United States. Well, this action was brought by the United States Congress, as we said, when President Nixon refused to release tapes and papers that Congress requested. And he cited executive privilege, which is exactly what President Trump did in regard to requests by House judicial committees and oversight committees, asking for information, asking for testimony. So this particular case, Congress sues the President, and the Supreme Court held unanimously that the Constitution of the United States did not endow the President with this type of power and ordered him to comply. And if you remember, what happens as a result of this is President Nixon starts to turn over the tapes, but before he can even turn over the tapes, he decides to resign the presidency. Unprecedented in the history of the United States. No president had ever said, "I quit." But that's what he did. He quit. So what does that mean for the current controversy? Well, I think we'll probably see in the next few months what it means and whether or not the Supreme Court, first the Court of Appeals, agrees with this approach. In regard to the expansion of Commander-in-Chief, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution of 1973. And in this, Congress said that before introducing troops into any actual or imminent hostility, the President would have to consult with Congress. And in any event, within 48 hours after committing U.S. troops, the President would have to report and explain their decision to Congress. And that any commitment could extend only 60 days unless they gave an extension. And that within this period, Congress could end the American military combat commitment by passing a joint resolution not subject to presidential veto. Well, guess what? President Trump has recently said that the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional and he can ignore it. So it's another constitutional controversy. And the one thing I'll say about this recent presidency is we have more constitutional controversies than we've ever had in the history of the president. What about impoundment? Well, again, the president was sued in a Supreme Court case called Train versus the City of New York. And this is when Nixon was sued for impounding funds that had been appropriated for services that were given to major cities for cleanup projects. And specifically in this case, New York City sued. And when it went to the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the president's obligation to take care that laws be faithfully executed. Remember that phrase? That the laws be faithfully executed. We said that was the first statement in Article 2 of the United States Constitution under executive powers. That the president's obligation to take care that law be faithfully executed included his obligation to spend money appropriated by Congress. So what we can see is all of these controversies. And there's some interesting case law that seems to apply. Class, let's see what happens over the next few months.